first presidential run. Looking at the notes underneath here, in a nation obsessed with equality, democracy was more and more associated with whiteness. While white Americans of all social classes dressed similarly and mixed in public, blacks were increasingly excluded from public life. Racist depictions of blacks in the culture became widespread. Minstrel shows. An ideology of racial superiority and inferiority with an allegedly scientific basis took root where it had never before existed. Remember, scientific racism. After 1800, every state admitted to the United States except Maine limited voting rights to white males. That's staggering. In 1821, the New York State Constitutional Convention that removed property qualifications for white voters raised requirements for blacks to $250, effectively disenfranchising, taking away the right to vote for nearly all New York blacks. By 1860, this is North, remember, blacks could vote on the same basis as whites, as I said earlier, in only 5 New England states, which had only 4% of the nation's free black population. Whites of the Revolutionary era had considered blacks as potential members of the body politic, meaning they could become part of we the people, the free blacks, back then in the Revolutionary era. But in the 19th century, membership in the political nation was increasingly demarcated by race: white free, black unfree. No blacks had full equality before the law, and they were barred from schools, militia, and other public institutions. In effect, race replaced class as the boundary between American men with political freedom and those without, a process that incorporated many white immigrants into American democracy. So it used to be land ownership, now it was skin color. Alright, the results of the 1824 presidential election, which we will have a lesson about in class. Looking at the notes underneath. And as you can see from this, in 1824, Andrew Jackson got the most electoral votes, got the most popular votes, but did not get enough to automatically win the election, so it goes back to the House. I'm going to read this paragraph, and it's going to introduce what is the, quote, alleged corrupt bargain, but we're going to have a lesson about it in class. In the 1824 presidential election, only candidate Andrew Jackson, known for his military victories, had nationwide support. The other candidates, John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts, William Crawford of Georgia, and Henry Clay of Kentucky, found support mostly in their regions. Though Jackson received the largest tally of the popular vote and carried all regions except for New England, none of the candidates received a majority of electoral college votes. Running last and eliminated was Henry Clay, meaning once it went to the House, Henry Clay couldn't be chosen. So basically, the House election came down to John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and William H. Crawford. Alright, the problem is Crawford had a stroke during the campaign, so essentially the House was choosing between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. So here's the so-called corrupt bargain. So running last and eliminated, Henry Clay used his influence to lead the House of Representatives into electing John Quincy Adams as president, whom Clay believed would promote the American system. Clay was soon appointed Secretary of State. This appointment led to charges that a, quote, corrupt bargain between Adams and Clay had secured the presidency for Adams and laid the basis for the emergence of a Democratic Party behind Andrew Jackson's candidacy in the 1828 election. The alliance around Adams and Clay came to form the opposition Whig Party in the 1830s. To make a long story short, the election went to the House. The House chose John Quincy Adams, and Henry Clay used his influence to get John Quincy elected. He did like John Quincy better as a candidate, didn't love both of them, and he thought Adams supported the American system, whereas Jackson would not. It meant more taxes. He was from the West, didn't like taxes. So the position of Secretary of State was very often seen as a stepping stone to the presidency. So Andrew Jackson and others accused them of striking a backdoor deal, a corrupt bargain. In other words, they must have said to each other, John said to Henry, if you get me elected, I will nominate you Secretary of State, and in 8 years you can become president. And that was the accusation. And that splits up the Democrat-Republicans into John Quincy Adams' half versus Jackson's half, the Republicans who become the Whigs versus the Democrats. That's the second party system, and they form between 1824 and 1828. So let's get to the John Quincy Adams administration, 1825 to 1829. Reading from the notes. John Quincy Adams came from a privileged background as the son of former President John Adams and had experience as a diplomat and senator in the U.S. Congress. Despite his uncharismatic nature, surprise, surprise, look who his father was, John Quincy Adams was strongly nationalist. He supported the American system of government, sponsored economic development. He was author of the Monroe Doctrine. He wanted to increase American commerce and power in the Western Hemisphere, and he hoped that the U.S. would eventually incorporate Canada, Cuba, and part of Mexico. Again, sounds pretty Hamiltonian there. Adams had a much larger view of federal power than many at the time. He thought the federal government should direct and sponsor internal improvements such as roads and canals, should pass laws to promote agriculture, manufacturing, and the arts, and he wanted to establish a national university and naval academy. When many Americans believed government power threatened freedom, Adams argued that liberty is power. His ideas horrified believers in strict construction of the Constitution, who wanted a limited role of the federal government, and Congress approved few of his programs. Now, some interesting factoids about John Quincy Adams. He enjoyed one of the most distinguished diplomatic careers in American history. He had a far more expansive view of national power than many of his contemporaries, which included the establishment of a national university, American University, creating a naval academy, which we have at Annapolis, building a national astronomical observatory, legislation promoting agriculture, commerce, manufacturing, we said that. He was the only member of Monroe's cabinet to oppose reprimanding Andrew Jackson for invading Spanish Florida. Talk about irony, they become enemies. And he was the only guy defending him earlier. Although a Federalist senator at the time, he had supported Jefferson's embargo policy. So let's look at the opposition to John Quincy Adams from 1825 to 1828-29. Some believed he allowed too much political control to be held by the elites, and to be sure, D.C. was elite-controlled. Some objected to his support of national economic development on constitutional grounds. So, in other words, remember, that stuff I talked about, the democratizing trends happening? Alright, that was happening outside the Oval Office and had an eventual effect on who becomes president by 1828. The de-elitification of D.C. happens in 1828 when Jackson gets elected. Alright? So Adams believed a strong, active central government was necessary. He believed in, as I said, a national university, an astronomical observatory, and a naval academy. Many Americans saw Adams' vision of a mighty nation led by a strong president as a threat to individual liberties. I love typos. Alright, John Quincy Adams, land and Indian policies. His land policies gave Westerners another reason to dislike him. He was nice to the Indians, sort of. He had tended to curb speculation for public lands. He wanted white people to kind of squat less and speculate less out west buy the land and try and sell it. And his opponents accused him of denying their individual rights and freedom to expand westward, take over the Indian land. He supported the land rights of Native Americans against white settlers. So again, more reason for the West to dislike him. Moving on, the 1828 election. Jackson's campaign was engineered by Senator Martin Van Buren of New York, MVB, Old Kinderhook, or OK for short. That's where the phrase comes from. If you were friends with Van Buren, you were OK. He wanted to recreate the old Jefferson coalition of Van Buren wanted to recreate this coalition of northern farmers and artisans, southern slave owners, farmers with small land holdings. He thus creates the Democratic Party from the remains of Jefferson's old Democrat-Republican Party. He becomes like the first party boss, so to speak, and runs the first national campaign that Jackson wins in 1828. He creates a national committee that oversaw local and state party units. He held mass meetings, parades, picnics, and there was a lot of political mudslinging on both sides. Jackson's campaign, one of their mottos was, "Vote for Jackson, he can fight, not for John Quincy Adams because he can write." He's a fancy-pants smart boy. Alright, so reading from the notes underneath, Adams rallied an opposition around Andrew Jackson dedicated to individual liberty, states' rights, and limited government. Jackson's campaign, organized by MVB, a New York senator, started immediately after Adams took office. While Adams typified an old politics in which elites ruled, Van Buren, the son of a barkeep, a tavern keeper, represented a new era in American politics, in which, here's the deletification, ordinary men could become party managers and professionals and wield great power. Van Buren believed political parties and party competition were legitimate and good for the Republic, by checking the power of administrations and offering voters choice. He also believed parties would suppress sectionalism by bringing together supporters and candidates from all across the country. Van Buren was alarmed by the sectionalism inspired by the slavery question in the Missouri debates, and he hoped to resurrect the Jeffersonian alliance between Southern planters and Northern farmers and urban workers. By 1828, Van Buren had created a vibrant Democratic Party embodying this alliance, and by using new techniques to mobilize mass voter turnout, he helped elect Jackson in a huge victory over Adams. Now, this all happened during the election of 1828. John Quincy Adams' supporters accused Jackson of murder. This is the mudslinging. Adams' supporters questioned the morality of Andrew Jackson's wife because she married Jackson while she was still married to another man. That actually happened. Jackson's supporters claimed that Adams had engaged in objectionable sexual practices while serving as a diplomat abroad. I don't know. Adams kept in office federal employees who openly campaigned for his opponent. Yeah. By the time of Jackson's presidency, politics often emphasized individual politicians with mass followings and popular nicknames. All right. The American Lion, Andrew Jackson. All right. Or Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson. Let's get to Rachel Jackson. So here's making a long story short. Andrew Jackson was born. He wasn't born wealthy, as we talked about. And Rachel was married to basically the man she was married to had an alcohol problem. He had a violence problem, and Rachel and her husband Louis Robards very often got into fights, and he would leave for pretty extended periods of time. Jackson was a boarder in their house. He had the hots for her. So at one point when they got in a fight and Louis leaves, Jackson makes his move and Rachel falls for him, and they wind up getting married. Problem is, she was still married to Louis. So she had to actually get a divorce from Louis and remarry Andrew. But that followed him to the White House. Her alleged immorality, that she married two men at one time. It will also come back during the Peggy Eaton affair, which we will look at the end of this PowerPoint, which is another very interesting story. And Jackson was known to challenge people to duels, defending her honor. Moving on. 1828 results. Jackson wipes the floor with John Quincy Adams. The South and the West voted for Jackson. The Northeast, most of the Northeast, as you can see, part of Maine, most of the Northeast voted for John Quincy Adams. So the new Jackson coalition was the planter elite in the South, people on the frontier, artisans, urban artisans, and state politicians who helped get Jackson elected, and in return, many of them got jobs in the White House or in the federal government, and that became known as the spoils system. To the victor belonged the spoils of war, of the enemy. So Jackson basically cleaned house and brought in his own people who helped him get elected, people on the state level who helped him get elected, and also immigrants, the Irish, in the cities. So Democrats in the 1830s generally believed that new corporate enterprises were suspicious. That's another belief of theirs. All right, so remember, this is basically Jackson's inauguration turns into basically a raucous party. He's got to be escorted out. You can see him there in the bow tie, looking a little pensive. All right, and it was a symbol of this. What's going to happen now? I can't. These elite are. What's going to happen to D.C.? It's going to go in a blank in a handbasket. All right. I don't know why that happened. Let's get to the Peggy Eaton affair. So Jackson hires a cabinet, and one of his cabinet members was John Eaton. And John Eaton was married to a woman named Margaret Eaton, and Margaret for short is Peggy. Okay. The problem is when Meg was married to another man before John, and he came down with an illness, and before he died, she kind of started saying John Eaton while she was still married to the previous guy. And at the first inaugural ball, the DC wives got wind of that. And here's what happened. Andrew Jackson's vice president was John Calhoun. John Calhoun's wife's name was Fluoride Calhoun. Well, let me tell you, she snubbed Peggy Eaton, would not say hi to her at that first inaugural ball. Okay? And let me tell you, socially speaking, that's just a no-no. Once Fluoride snubbed Peggy, all the other cabinet wives snubbed Peggy. And Peggy was getting the silent treatment from all the elite of D.C. So Andrew Jackson was fit to be tied. First of all, it was a very similar situation under which his marriage happened. So he felt a sense of solidarity with John and Peggy. Also, he said something like, and I'm paraphrasing here, "I'm not going to let some D.C. wives tell me how to run my country." Something like that. So it was also stubbornness and machismo that was part of it. So Jackson was sticking to his guns. People were calling for him to fire John Eaton and replace him with someone else. He was refusing. He even went so far as to hire like a second cabinet called his kitchen cabinet, because his regular cabinet members were ineffective and were part of this whole shunning of Peggy. It actually wound up resolving itself when John Eaton resigned to kind of diffuse the situation. But the important thing is the Peggy Eaton affair is the first crack in the political alliance between Andrew Jackson and John Calhoun, his vice president. Now, this is a minor issue in the scheme of things. You know, it's a social gaffe that mess up they were between each other. But it was the first crack. Once we get to other events of Jackson's presidency that involve Calhoun and Jackson, remember, this was the first crack, the Peggy Eaton affair. And if I'm not mistaken, I think eventually, later in life, Peggy, either John died or she left John for her young dancing teacher and fled to Europe with him. So she was a great woman. Alright, be sure to take the quiz that will pop up right now.